Good morning, everyone. I'm Gavin Kelly, Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation. And I was going to say a warm welcome to you. It is a very warm welcome to you today. Well, not so warm down here. Thank you, all of you in the room, for coming along. And I know there's lots of you online too, so thank you to you too. Today's event is Britain working? And we will get to an answer, I promise you, by the end of the event. Now, some of you may have noted that this has been an election campaign, in my view at least, with a relatively limited focus on policy, which if you are in business is a little bit dispiriting. And that's in part, I think, because, and I'll put this diplomatically, some political parties are giving the media plenty of other things to talk about other than policy. But it's also because there are, in some key areas, some relatively modest differences in the manifestos, at least, between the two main parties, which has sort of muted conversation to some degree. However, that is not really the case when it comes to today's topic. When it comes to the labour market, there are some really material differences, I think, in the two different main party manifestos, at least, with some relatively clear choices, as well as some things which are not so clear, and we'll come to that, which I think is, a good thing for an election. You want some choices in democratic politics. So I think when it comes to the labour market, at least, there are some choices to be made. And we will focus on those, but we'll try and put them this morning in the context of the last 14 years. So we want to look ahead, but we want to do it in the context of what has been. And that's the kind of theme running through a lot of these pre-election events we've been hosting at the Resolution Foundation. And if we look at it over that 14-year period, I don't need to tell you, it's been a pretty eventful period, from the aftershocks of financial crisis through to Brexit, COVID, cost of living crisis. All of those things have reverberated through the country, but also through the jobs market in lots of different ways. So we've had, external shocks playing out on our jobs market at the same time as we've had quite a lot of public policy change too. We'll hear about the national living wage as a major shift over this time period, but we've also had we've had deregulation of employment protection in some ways. We've had changes in work incentives, and we've had a changing kind of migration regime too. So there's been a lot going on, and depending on what you want to look at or focus on, you can either tell a story of disastrous performance on some counts, or you can tell a story of relative success compared to other periods in our recent history. So I think we're going to be aiming for a kind of a balanced verdict when we go through the last 14 years, but there is plenty there to get stuck into. Now, to help us do that, we have assembled, I think, a brilliant panel this morning. I'll very briefly introduce. We're going to hear first from my colleague on the right, Hannah Slaughter, who is a senior economist here at the Resolution Foundation and leads lots of our labour market work. Then we're going to hear from Nicholas Smith, who is the head of basically everything, as far as I can tell. There's a very long list of things you're the head of. You need to lose some stuff.
I know.
You do need to lose.
It needs sorting.
I'm going to say that you're like the guru of all things economic and social policy at the TUC, rather than read out a very long sentence. And then we're going to hear from Louise Helen, who is Chief Economist, a nice simple job title, at the CBI. And I should also say, before that, Louise worked for a long time at the Treasury on things like the national living wage. Which is great. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Alan Manning, who is a professor at the LSE, one of the country's top economists. It doesn't say that here, but that's my view. And also, until not that long ago, chaired the Migration Advisory Committee, which is relevant. So that's who we're going to hear from. And the way we're going to do this is, so Hannah's going to give you a sense of the report which published today, which obviously you must all read. It's on our website. But Hannah's going to give you the highlights. Then we'll hear from our speakers. We'll have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves on the panel, and then we're going to open it up, make sure we've got some time for that. We will also, as ever, have a poll for you on slido.com. You know what to do, where to go. And if you're online and want to ask questions, I will try and take some questions from Slido as well. And if you're a tweeter, if that's, or whatever you want to call it, I believe Is Britain Working is the hashtag. And that, I think, is enough by way of introduction. Okay, Hannah, take it away.
Thanks, Gavin. And yeah, just to firstly thank the Nuffield Foundation who funded this work, and also to thank my colleague Nye Cominetti who co-authored this with me. So I definitely would echo Gavin's recommendation to read the full report, because I'm only going to be able to give you a very brief overview of the key points in 10 or 12 minutes. But I'll first look back at what's happened in the labour market since 2010, and then take a bit of a look forward at the challenges that the next government will face. So again, as Gavin mentioned, there's definitely been kind of good news and bad news on the labour market since 2010, and I'm going to start with some of the good news. If the slides will work. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this chart is showing you the working age employment rate since about the 1970s, and that green line on the right hand side shows the employment rise in the 2010s, where employment reached a record high, 76.2% just before the pandemic. And that was the strongest growth in the employment rate that we've had since the 1980s. So some good news there in the run up to the pandemic on employment. How does this compare to other countries? Again, this is being a bit slow, but okay, great. So this is showing OECD countries and how our rise in the employment rate during the 2010s compared. So the chart isn't in order for reasons that will become clear in a minute, but the UK is sort of towards the right-hand side there in a darker shade. And we were kind of in the upper half of these OECD countries when it comes to our increase in employment during the 2010s. But where we are an international outlier for the wrong reasons is what's happened since the pandemic. So here now the red bars are showing you the change since 2019 until 2023. And we are actually one of only 6 OECD countries where the employment rate has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And that's brought us down the international league table here. So now we're in the bottom half of these OECD countries. And that's because, as we go into in a bit more detail in the report, that's largely because of rising inactivity, and in particular, and very concerningly, because of rising ill health among the working age population. And that's a big policy challenge that the next government will need to face. And so I'll come back to that a bit later in the presentation. When it comes to wages, again, there have been ups and downs, a bit of a roller coaster, as this chart shows. So the coloured kind of blocks start from the 2010 election, and just to talk through them all very, very briefly. So starting with the period up until 2014, where we saw a continuation of the pay squeeze that started after the financial crisis, where real wages fell as inflation outpaced pay growth. After that, and for the second half of the 2010s, we had some pay recovery, but relatively slow. And by the end of the 2010s, real wages were still lower than they were at the start of the decade. That's the first time that's happened since the 1920s. So poor performance throughout the 2010s on pay. Then we had the COVID-19 pandemic, where there were ups and downs again, partly because of the furlough scheme, partly because of changes in who was in work over that period. And then that was followed by the cost of living crisis, where again we saw a real wage squeeze because inflation outpaced earnings growth that has only just started to recover. So ups and downs, but the big picture is very much for wage stagnation. So in the latest data, average wages were only £16 a week higher than they were at the time of the May 2010 election. And if our wages had grown at the same rate as those in the US and Germany over that period, about 0.8% a year, we'd be £3,600 a year better off. So it's a pretty dire picture on wage growth. The glimmer of hope on the pay story is for what's happened at the bottom of the distribution. So the minimum wage has been a big success story, particularly rises since 2016, when the national living wage was introduced. This chart is showing you what that's meant for inequality. So the red line is the gap between the top earners and the middle. The blue line is between the middle and the lowest earners, and you can see that blue line is, so inequality between the middle and the bottom of the hourly pay distribution is now at its lowest level since at least the mid-1970s, so some good news there. So that labour market legacy has big implications for what the next government will need to contend with. So that big employment fall means that it's not surprising that both parties have said that they want to restart employment growth and increase employment in the years ahead. That's going to be challenging. So this is... if I can get to the next slide. Sorry, tech is failing me today. Here we go. So this is what's kind of the status quo, what the OBR is expecting over the next parliament, and it's essentially flatlining employment growth. I mean, that doesn't mean that growth isn't possible, but it does mean that the next government is going to have to think carefully about its policy proposals because they're not going to benefit from employment growth that's going to happen anyway. And just for comparison, this green line is showing what would happen to employment if we restarted the growth that we had during the 2010s of about 0.7 percentage points a year. We'd get to about 78% by the end of the next parliament. So in brief, what are the parties proposing to do about this? Both are sensibly focusing particularly on health, and that's sensible because we know that the post-pandemic employment fall has been driven by rising ill health. Some of Labour's proposals include careers and mental health support for young people, as well as local skills and employment support tied into health. And on the Conservative side, they've talked about the benefit system and particularly disability benefits, which we've got another report from last week focusing on particularly, as well as wider reforms to taxes and benefits. So both parties are united in their goal of increasing employment, even if they have different ways of getting there. But there are two areas where the parties diverge much more in their plans for the labour market. So the first is on the minimum wage. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the context, this chart is showing what's happened to the minimum wage as a percentage of typical hourly pay since it was introduced. It's obviously been increasing over time, and particularly ambitious increases since 2016 when the national living wage was introduced. We now have one of the highest minimum wages in the world. That's, as I set out earlier, very good news for the lowest earners. Both parties were, broadly speaking, united in wanting a higher minimum wage. A pretty kind of shared goal in broad terms, but that's no longer the case. So in the manifestos that have come out in the last couple of weeks, first of all, this is showing what the Conservatives are proposing. So they want to hold the bite of the minimum wage, so its level relative to typical hourly pay, constant. Through to the end of the next parliament. That doesn't mean it won't rise in cash terms because it will track average earnings, but it does mean that they're breaking from their own ambitious approach over the past decade. It's a bit more uncertain when it comes to the Labour Party's policy. They've talked about the minimum wage accounting for the cost of living. At one extreme, that could be interpreted as converging with the real living wage, the one that's voluntary and calculated according to the cost of living. That yellow line there shows what that would mean in terms of the bite. But it's unclear what that would mean kind of in the future if they were to converge at some point, because there's so many moving parts going into that. And it would be an ambitious increase if that was what they meant. But you could equally interpret what the Labour Party have said as just the minimum wage not falling in real terms, so accounting for inflation. And that's not very ambitious in the sense that that's basically what happens anyway. The second area where the parties have diverged is on wider labour market rules. So here, the Conservative Party have basically said nothing about reforming the labour market. They've said they want to stick with what they refer to as the UK's flexible labour market, whereas under the Labour Party, they've proposed a significant package of reform. So here's some of the things in their package. So includes things like strengthening sick pay, a fair pay agreement in social care, contracts that reflects hours worked, stronger enforcement, and something I'll come back to in a moment, which is day one rights, including protection against unfair dismissal, which you currently have to wait for 2 years to get. But again, it's unclear what they actually mean by this in practice, because they say that if they get into power, they would consult on the details of these plans. So we can say a bit about what the benefits might be and what the risks might be on the other side of the scale, but it really depends on what the details end up being. So to give you a bit of a sense, there are currently over 1 million employees who currently aren't eligible for statutory sick pay because they earn too little. They could stand to benefit if they're brought into scope. If there's a fair pay agreement in the social care sector, that could benefit 1.7 million workers. And we know that 7.2 million workers report anxiety over last minute changes to their hours. So if there are more rights to predictable contracts, for example, that could benefit them. But again, it's really dependent on what the specifics end up being. On the other side of the scale, there are potential risks, as always, from improving labour market rights that might increase employers' costs. So particularly if there are day one rights to unfair dismissal, there's a possible risk of job losses. But again, this depends on the specifics because the Labour Party have talked about probationary periods where it might be easier to dismiss new hires for a certain amount of time. But again, TBC if they get elected, depending on what decision would be made. But just to kind of illustrate how a potential Labour government might think about this, what are the trade-offs from strengthening employment rights? So this chart is showing the relationship between so unemployment on the vertical axis. This is showing different countries in the OECD, and on the horizontal axis here is the OECD's indicator of how easy it is to dismiss workers. So easier on the left-hand side, harder on the right-hand side. So the link between that metric and unemployment is very weak. There's a very slight relationship, but the countries are kind of all over the graph. The relationship is barely there at all. There is more evidence, however, when it comes of a trade-off when it comes to hiring rates. So again, the same indicator on the horizontal axis, but now we're looking at the hiring rate on the vertical axis. And it does seem that countries where it's harder to dismiss individual workers do tend to have lower hiring rates. That doesn't mean that this isn't something that the Labour Party, if they get elected, should follow through with. There's always trade-offs, and it's something we consider explicitly in the case of the minimum wage, for example. But it does highlight the need for careful implementation and thinking about those probationary periods and what they would mean in practice. So just to conclude, so looking back, the labour market since 2010 has been one of both light and shade. So strong employment growth during the 2010s, followed by a fall post-pandemic, record pay stagnation, but good news at the bottom thanks to the minimum wage. And when we look ahead, whichever party wins will need to think about how to boost employment and how to reverse that fall that we've seen since the pandemic. But where it's clear that the election's outcome will really matter on labour market policy is whether we see a continuation of the current system, if the Conservatives win, or if Labour win, the biggest overhaul of labour market rights in a generation.
Thank you, Hannah. Brilliant. That was a formidable amount of material in a not very long period of time. So thank you so much. Over to you, Nicola.
I'll just sit here, right? Yeah, great.
Definitely sit here, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. That's such an interesting overview. What do I make about all that? Well, I suppose I would say that from my perspective, there is more shade than light in how the labour market has performed over the last 14 years. We did some polling right at the start of this year, 2024. 1 in 7 people said their living standards were anywhere close to getting bigger. 4 out of 10 said even since the start of this year, they were still feeling worse off. And I think that gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge that there has been on living standards, and the fact that even while we've seen a few months of the data improving, people are still reporting that they are feeling much worse off. We know that debt levels, unsecured personal debt, are still on OBR forecasts set to hit extremely high levels this year. And when you look at what's happening to real wages, I think they are still, it's true to say, below where they were in 2008, maybe just a few pounds above where they were in 2010. And people in this room, and Hannah and colleagues will all have seen the charts showing that had wages continued to grow at their pre-crisis rate, people would be literally thousands of pounds better off than they are. So while we have seen employment go up, we've also seen very poor economic growth. We've seen some of the worst growth rates for this country in modern record. I think we've seen a sort of average growth rate in modern economic history of about 2.4% a year. The average over the most recent period's been about 1.5%. And that's shown up, right? That's shown up in, we've seen people stay in jobs, but we've seen this huge hit to living standards. So something's gone very badly wrong. We haven't been getting the growth rates that we used to. We've seen people, at least before the pandemic, remaining in work, but at big cost to their incomes and to their expectations of the living standards that people had come to quite rightly expect in post-war Britain. And since then, things have only got dramatically worse. Yes, we've had the pandemic and the international shock of the war in Ukraine, but we've also had pretty poor responses to both of those crises. And as Hannah set out, the situation since then has become much more challenging again, particularly in terms of economic inactivity. I was really struck by a chart I saw that showed that it might have been a Resolution Foundation chart, in fact, that showed that some of the rates of people claiming out-of-work benefits now because of disability and ill health are comparable with the incapacity benefit claims that we saw sort of back in 2005. And that was when the country was still living with the legacy of thousands and thousands of people being moved on to incapacity benefit during the industrial during the deindustrialization period in the 80s and the 90s. So, the scale of this challenge and the importance of addressing it, but the difficulty of supporting people who have been spending long times out of work because of poor health and enabling them to get back into work, or indeed preventing that number of people who find themselves in that position from growing, should not be understated. I think that is a really, really significant challenge, and it has huge effects for the individuals concerned as well as for the overall health of our economy and the jobs market. And I don't think you can, in this instance, separate out that trend from what we've seen in terms of NHS funding and the length of the waiting list, because there is absolutely a clear link, and we hear it from employers as well as from workers that this is one of the big reasons that people are out of work for longer because of ill health. And I suppose the other key trend, before I go on to what's happening next from our perspective, has been this increase in insecure work. Now, I don't believe that everybody at work is facing huge insecurity, but I do think there's strong evidence that at the bottom of the labour market, job quality has deteriorated, and we haven't paid enough attention to the quality and the opportunities of those minimum wage jobs and jobs in some of the lower wage sectors, because we've now got, I think, 4.1 million people by the TUC's definition, and it's quite a conservative definition, in extremely insecure work, where you have no notice of shifts, where you can be texted the night before demanding that you go into work, where you don't know from day to day whether you're going to be earning the same yesterday that you were the day before, or indeed if you're going to have enough money to pay your bills at the end of the week. And we just don't think in a modern economy people should be required to work in that way with that level of risk on the worker. And it's a challenge that I think the next government needs to address. And, the sorts of jobs that are involved in that number, from our perspective, that's 0 hours contracts, that's very low wage, self-employment, casual and seasonal work. And as I say, we draw our definition pretty tight. But look, what about what's happening next, and where Hannah was getting onto there? I think we have a really exciting opportunity in some of the proposals that the Labour Party has set out, and in the opportunity to actually restart a debate in this country about what we think our labour market, what does good labour market performance look like? Because I'm really struck, one of my big frustrations, and there are many, as you can imagine, of the last 14 years, but is that there has not been a space to question this very orthodox assumption that, we hear from the government in their manifesto, we want to maintain this flexible labour market that's apparently performing so well. Well, is it? It's not delivering decent wages. It's not delivering jobs at the moment. We've got record numbers of people out of work. I think there's an opportunity to look back at some of those assumptions, to look at the very strong OECD evidence, which has moved very substantially, for those of you who are interested in it, from the 1994 job study, which claimed that flexible labour markets were the be-all and end-all, to their most recent publications, which recognise the economic benefits of institutions like collective bargaining, of labour market regulation, for boosting both employment and incomes and wider social outcomes across economies. I think there's an opportunity to consider as a society, what do we actually think good looks like, and how do we achieve better outcomes across our jobs market, both in terms of the types of job people are doing and the numbers of people in work. I think you can argue very compellingly that if you have better employment protection, then you make it easier for people to take the chance of moving jobs. I think you can show that where you have stronger, more secure incomes, you boost demand and you boost your economy overall. I think you can show that it's much easier for people to move back into work if they know they're going to have good quality flexible working, if the risk of them moving into jobs is not so extreme, and if they are able to have patterns of work that reflect their own needs, whether that's their health needs or their caring needs, rather than only those of their employers. You know, we often hear that people like 0 hours contracts because they give them flexibility. Well, we've polled on that. We'll be publishing it in the next few weeks, I imagine. And it shows very strongly that actually people do not like that flexibility. They absolutely want the security to run their own lives in the way that they need to, and find that they have more problems with care and with balancing wider responsibilities in their life than those of us on secure contracts. Gavin's telling me I need to stop now. So there's my, I could clearly go on.
You on.
But I suppose my point is there's an opportunity to examine some of the assumptions which I do not think are always correct. And I think the evidence base and the international evidence base shows that we need to be more ambitious in terms of where we think the jobs market can go. So, you know, there's many proposals in the manifestos. The Conservative Party are proposing to continue with their minimum service levels. This is the attempt to remove the right to strike from workers who feel they have no choice but to remove their labour in some areas of public service. I mean, quite interesting, the manifesto says they're going to continue to implement the policy. Well, nobody's used MSLs yet, because any employer in their right mind knows that it would be very destructive to impose such an approach on their workforce and would aggravate workplace relations rather than improve them. But anyway, that's about all that there is to say in there on employment rights. And in contrast, there's an ambitious offer from the Labour Party, both in terms of individual employment rights and collective rights, and an ambition, I think, that is about thinking how we might together develop a labour market which delivers both on the sorts of quality jobs, but also on the employment outcomes that are going to be absolutely key to addressing some of the challenges that were set out in those slides.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And hopefully with questions we can come back to some of what the evidence points you raise about kind of regulation and hiring and so on, because it's interesting. Louise, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And first, well done, Hannah, and to the team. Yeah, really great report, and I think it's really interesting to look at a lot of the trends that we have seen over this period. And I think, like you say, there's lots of nuance to that, but what the report clearly showed is that strong employment growth that we did see over the kind of 2010s, and I think during that period and previous to that, historically the UK labour market had been seen as one of the kind of core strengths of the UK, with kind of good access to talent. And I think, you know, when I speak to members at the moment, it really does seem that a lot has changed in the recent period, you know, especially post-pandemic. It's incredibly hard for firms at the moment to make sure that they are finding the right talent that they need, that they just have enough workers. And again, some of the work that we've done in terms of our employment trends survey showed that 70% of businesses have been impacted by labour shortages over the last year, and more than half are saying that the cost of employment is becoming a threat to competitiveness as well, and that's the kind of highest, second highest proportion in that survey. Only exceeded by the rate the year before, which was nearly 60%. So it kind of has improved, but it's still a really big concern for employers at the moment. But as the report outlines, and again, as Nicola said, I think one of the really worrying things is the increase in inactivity that we've seen post-pandemic. You know, that has been a really big factor behind some of these shortages, but also is in combination with that longer running challenge of demographic change in the UK as well that we're facing from an ageing society. If we think about the context of where we are going into the election at the moment, one of the things that we are pleased to see from all political parties is that they have a big emphasis on growth and how we can get the economy growing. But decisions on the labour market, I think, are really central to that question and whether we can unlock the growth that we're going for. As I just said there, in terms of the firms that we speak to, 70% of those are experiencing labour shortages at the moment. That has a real impact on the ability for firms to meet the demand that they've got. It says 38% of firms were unable to respond to new business opportunities because of that shortage of labour. 12% of businesses said they had to turn down customers, turn down demand because they didn't have enough staff. So I think for us, as we're looking ahead going forward, there's two really big challenges for the labour market at the moment. They're very big, and they're, as always with these things, very interrelated as well. The first one, as I was saying, is around shortages. And I think, as I say, shortages and the problems around that have eased somewhat over the last kind of 6 months or so, in line actually with the weaker economy that we have seen. But vacancies remain historically high, and we are actually expecting growth in the economy to pick up a little bit more towards the end of this year and next year. And so I think there is a really big risk, as we're seeing that demand increase, that we were going to face these problems of shortages again. That's only going to get worse. And like I say, whilst we've seen that big issue around inactivity at the moment, this is adding into the challenge we know that we're facing in an ageing society. So I think one statistic that really hits for me is by 2040, we're expecting that 1.4 million more people will be retiring from the labour market each year than will be joining the labour force as well. So I think that is a really big challenge that we're facing into. And I think it's why we really need to think about a new economic model that is really centred around productivity as well. And I think that's the second big challenge. I know the Resolution Foundation, again, has done lots of work on this, and particularly in other reports rather than today. But I think it's obviously really interconnected to this discussion around the labour market, particularly because of the flip side of some of that good news we saw in terms of wage growth. And actually, as the report sets out, that poor wage growth performance has been underlined by the poor productivity growth that we have seen in the UK. And sustainable wage growth really goes hand in hand with that productivity. And as I think hopefully we can all celebrate the success that we've seen in the national living wage over this period, and the benefits that has brought to the lower pay, actually we are seeing a kind of condensing of some of the wage levels within companies, because firms aren't able to provide those same pay increases all across the wage spectrum, because we don't have that stronger productivity growth to unlock it as well. So I think, like I say, the answer that we really need to look at is how we're increasing productivity in the UK. And for us, one of the key things around that is increasing investment, and particularly a lot of that investment is going to come from the private sector as well. And I think one of the risks, as I say, is that businesses are facing quite a lot of costs at the moment, particularly around labour costs. And I think there is obviously an argument out there that rising labour costs themselves will lead to higher investment, firms finding ways to avoid higher labour costs. But the experience of the last few years, and again, the conversations that I have with a lot of our members, is that isn't the case. And actually the higher costs are what is squeezing out investment opportunities. Firms saying at the moment they're really struggling to find the talent that they need. Especially this last year, we've seen some really high wage increases that have chased some of those real skill shortages, and that is meaning that they're either having to delay investment or putting off investment decisions as well. So I think we need to find that sweet spot of where we've got the right incentives, but we're really supporting that investment as well. One of the things that we're looking for with the new government is making sure that they do have that real plan around how that they increase growth and investment. And I think that, as I say, really needs to come hand in hand with labour market policies. And kind of one example around that would be net zero. We know that is going to be both a huge opportunity, but in many ways a kind of new industrial revolution. And you need to make sure that you've got the right workforce plan alongside that. Specifically on the labour market, kind of 3 quick areas as well that we'd really like to see. Firstly is removing some of the barriers that we talked about of boosting labour supply, particularly on inequality that we've mentioned. There's been quite a lot recently, and there's quite a bit in the manifestos around childcare support as well. That is really welcome, but again, we need to make sure that we've got the childcare providers there to make sure those places come along. And obviously Labour's New Deal has been mentioned, and whilst I think that there are things in there that we can look at, some of the things do risk having unintended consequences, and particularly some of the things around day one rights. You know, if we're not allowing for probation periods, there is a risk that firms become more risk averse when they're looking to hire people at the edges of the labour market as well. So I do think that's something we need to carefully think about. Secondly, we really need to make sure that businesses are supported in that investment in automation and new technologies that can be a complement to labour. And thirdly, we need to make sure that we are investing in people who are currently in the labour market to make sure they've always got the latest skills as well. And for us, a lot of that is around reform of the apprenticeship levy as well. So overall, I think the labour market has had quite a few areas of strengths, and we really do believe that it can be an area of strength for the UK again going forward. But I think we really need to see the UK come together and tackle some of those big challenges, particularly around shortages and productivity. And I think we just need to be careful about some of the unintended consequences of the way that we could tackle that as well.
Thank you so much, Louise. So we've got everyone agreeing on light and shade, but people disagreeing on the balance, I think. And I'm pleased you mentioned, obviously you're right to mention productivity and indeed inactivity. And we have had, Hannah couldn't talk about everything in one report, otherwise it'd be a report about everything. But we have done recent reports in this election campaign on both of those topics, which I would recommend to people because obviously they're totally integral, as Louise rightly says, to this discussion. Alan, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for a great report. Normally at these kind of events, I often get introduced as an expert. Then I read the report and I think, oh, I didn't know that actually. And, so much for so-called experts. So first of all, as being said, I think, what is key, the key weakness has been the failure of living standards to grow. The people just don't believe anymore that the future is going to be better than the present or even than the past. And that sense of pessimism suffuses everything and is very, I think, very costly for us. So, a new Labour government with an emphasis on growth, that's that's where we have to be. But of course, it's not that, it's not that easy to just generate growth. I'm slightly concerned that Keir Starmer's genie has been working very, very hard and was hoping for a day off on July the 5th, but he's going to be put to work generating growth for the UK economy. But I think so. We normally think of growth and the productivity side of things, but I think you kind of also sometimes we forget that also living standards is basically real wages. It's wages divided by prices, and I think we also neglect the price side of those things. So those typically aren't labour market policies, but actually I think policies on housing costs and policies on energy costs are really important to actually getting living standards rising as well. So all the stuff around planning and house building is really important. And all the stuff around Great British Energy is really important that we obviously transition to net zero, but in doing so that we are actually driving energy costs down, not up, I think. And I think that's possible. So growth is kind of really, should be front and centre. On the minimum wage, I'm sort of getting a bit I think there has to come a point at which we think, the minimum wage is high enough in relation to average earnings. We can't keep on pushing it up. I kind of slightly think we might be at that point. I'm not quite sure. I do wonder whether we shouldn't go back to the principles of the national living wage, which at its inception was inspired in part by the Resolution Foundation, I think. Although it was a higher minimum wage basically for the over 25s, was it? Originally over 26? Yeah, over the 25s. That gets a bad press because it's seen as a lower minimum wage for young workers, and this is wrong. But the positive arguments for a higher minimum wage for the older workers were three. Firstly, the average level of wages for older workers is much higher, so their labour market can support a higher minimum wage. Secondly, if you're a minimum wage worker at age 25, you're much more likely to be a permanent minimum wage worker, for life, rather than just, a student doing a temporary job. And thirdly, that if you're a minimum wage worker at age 25, you're much more likely to have dependents and so on. And so while poverty is bad, child poverty is even worse. So those were the positive arguments for having a higher minimum wage for older workers. So it come to be seen as a negative thing. And I think that was a bit of a mistake. So I might be tempted to go back to that. But I also think we need to perhaps pay more attention to the quality of work perhaps than the pay than we had to. So I think the New Deal for working people is kind of it is very important. And one of the big trends that I think has been very bad over the last few, well, it's longer than the last 14 years actually, but it's been accentuating in the last 14 years, is what we've been doing is we've been shifting risk from employers, from firms, from the government onto individuals. So, for example, sickness benefits are not being increased in relation to average earnings. Employers offering 0 hours contracts, and so that puts a lot of income risk onto individuals. They don't know how much they're going to earn from week to week. Lower income households just don't have buffers to be able to deal with that kind of thing. Puts a lot of stress on people. So I think we kind of need to be taking the balance on that. I mean, the current periods of like 2 years until you have full rights, that is ridiculously long. Employers do not need 2 years to decide whether a new employee is a suitable worker, a good match or not for them. At the same time, I am slightly worried. I do think there should perhaps be a probation period. When you hire a worker, you are buying something a bit sight unseen, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. And I think there's something to be said for doing that. So I think we've got to get the right balance is the right word I would say there. And then in terms of, I worry that shift of risking onto people is one of the reasons we have seen this rise in ill health, which in particular is around mental health issues, because risks put stress on people, and stress on people is one of the factors which cause people to have issues with mental health. And so if the Labour Party is to get to its 80% target for employment growth, it's got to sort out all that stuff around health and disability, incapacity. Not very easy. Lots of other countries have that problem, but that should be a relentless focus. And I slightly worry that actually the way that work has evolved has actually has been part of the reason of the cause of that. And we need to think, and better quality work will itself make those things better. So perhaps I'll just stop there. Is that
Brilliant.
Done my time?
You have,
Yeah.
That's perfect, Alan. Thank you. Nice and pithy and to the point. Well done. Right, before we open it up, we're going to first of all bring a poll up, which Alan, without knowing, I think kind of set up quite nicely in terms of what's the wording? What should be the top labour market priority for the next government? And you're obviously going to sort of say all of these things are important, and that is not the spirit of this question. You have to choose. Is it high minimum wage? Is it kind of greater protection, new employment rights, greater protection? Is it enforcing the rights we currently have, which are not enforced all too often? He says pointedly. Is it supporting more people into work, which, as lots of our speakers have said, is really important? Or is it kind of shifting the burden of tax away from labour onto other forms of unearned income? So you go to slido.com and let us know what you think. It'd be interesting to see. So let's just do, we haven't got all that long, and I've got far too many questions, so I'm not going to use them all, but let me just take a few. Let's briefly look backwards before we look forwards. And Alan, let me just start with you. One thing that strikes me about this discussion, which is kind of very, to simplify, pay, disaster, employment, quite impressive. That's muddied by post-COVID period, but is that people who say that, lots of us who say that, too rarely put those two things together and say, well, obviously, how are these two things related? One way in which they may be related, which is a story which doesn't get told often enough potentially, is that one of the reasons we saw such an employment growth was a labour supply response, people trying to work more hours because they were so poor and had not had the growth of living standards that they would have expected if we'd had productivity growth and wages going up. Partly because of what happened to wages and partly because some of those people lost significant amounts of benefits. Is that how we should think about? I'm just trying to get our heads big picture wise around what happened in this period. Is that part of the story, or do you see it differently?
I mean, I think it's part of the story. So that, yes, I mean, the social insurance that we're offering through the welfare system is becoming a lot weaker. Yep. I mean, that's part of the shifting risks onto individuals that I talked about. And, one way in which people respond to that may be to work a bit more, but they end up, with still facing higher risks. And so in some sense, yes, you can get your headline employment rate up in that way, but there's a cost to that in terms of quality of work broadly defined. Yeah. And that shouldn't really be what we should be aiming for. We should be, aiming to move forward on both dimensions, quality and quantity.
Yeah. Totally. Okay, just another sort of looking back, reflecting back on what we've learnt, if you like, about our labour market over this period. I mean, one thing, and I mean, Louise, it'd be good to get your take, maybe Nicola too, on this, is, the minimum wage story. So in 2014, as Alan sort of said, that we at this organisation proposed that basically we needed more ambition, and so we kind of said there should be a kind of guiding light of trying to get to 60%, we said, of typical pay by 2020. Everyone respectable in this field, Alan, I think, was an exception, basically said, you're completely mad. This is like a massive roll of the dice. What are you doing? Don't take these risks. And to his credit, George Osborne went for it. We're now at 67%, right? So we've gone miles beyond the reckless, as we were called, number that we came up with back then. Sorry, this sounds pointed. But it was a really big debate about it. And we've gone miles beyond that. And basically, I mean, we can talk about the micro details, but basically there's been no material impact is the kind of headline story, I think, which doesn't mean to say that will continue. I'm not, there's a different question about the future. But what does that tell us? I mean, that is a big deal, right? We have really ramped up pay at the bottom compared to pay in the middle, and we haven't had the negative consequences that sort of most people said we would have. So what does that tell us about how the labour market operates? How does, what are the CBI sort of take from that, basically?
So, I mean, I think in the first place, like I say, I think, it is really welcome to see what the national living wage has done over that period and the benefits that it has brought for many individuals. I think there is a question, though, about, given where we are, where we do go next. And I think even though, on the headline, we might not have seen, at least some of the scare stories around much higher unemployment and things like that, I think there have still been consequences. And I think one of the big ones for us is thinking about what is the impact that it has, particularly if you think about from the perspective of a firm when it's setting wage decisions, often it has a kind of pot that it can set aside to make wage changes for the employers that it has. And if you have a kind of increase that it needs to allocate to those on the national living wage, then it often squeezes that for those more in the middle. And we can obviously say that, there is a real need for those on the lower wages to make sure that they do have that living wage. But there are implications for that, not least for those people who are in the middle who, again, have not seen those increases. But I think one of the big impacts it has as well is those incentives to progress, actually. And we quite often hear, and obviously it's not all firms and things, but particularly where some of those differences in roles, the pay associated with roles is quite small. If you're asking people to take on additional responsibility, but you're not really able to pay them that much more, they're kind of like, well, what's in it for me? Yeah, and I think that, again, if you're just looking at that small step change, you think, oh, okay, well, maybe that doesn't really matter that much. But actually, if that is then your ladder for further progression, I think it does have an impact. So I think, the work that has been done so far is great. And, the CBI has been a big supporter of the national living wage. But I do think that we need to think about where is next and whether the current level that we're at is probably about right. But even if you have greater ambition, like I said, I think the big kind of elephant in the room here is actually thinking about how you make sure that those wage increases are sustainable. And for us, that really comes down to productivity. Sure,
no, productivity. But Alan, I mean, it'd be remiss not to ask you the same question in a way, given that you are an expert on employer power and what that does to labour markets. I mean, basically, is it the case that there was just more employer power in the lower end of our labour market than we thought? Or what's your explanation as to why we haven't seen the negative consequences?
So I mean, I think that, I was always been in favour of the minimum wage, but even I was a bit surprised about how high we've been able to go without. So I think actually the aspect that I'm a bit more worried about is not so much with the traditional worry that as you push up the minimum wage, the quantity of jobs go down. It's that it makes employers much more cautious about the hours that they actually pay for. So, for example, 0 hours contracts can become more attractive potentially because, you only pay for the hours that you think you're going to get the workers who are actually needed. Or you might look to push workers onto self-employment because there's no minimum wage at all for the self-employed. So I'm sort of more worried about those aspects of things, that was the effect. I don't know it's entire, the evidence on that base is very weak. There's some evidence Resolution Foundation has done this, the job satisfaction falling for the lowest paid workers, and perhaps some of that. So I would be looking at that. I'm not sure about that, but that's where I would be slightly nervous about the minimum wage may not have been totally 100% fantastic, and why I might be a bit nervous about pushing it higher and think we should be concentrating more on the sort of non-wage quality aspects of it.
Nick, let's just pick up on that, but in a slightly different way, which is, so obviously, the TUC, not surprisingly, in favour of a high minimum wage, no spot there. But Alan's point surely has merit in the sense of, if you're having a high minimum wage and you're pushing on like 4 other fronts of improving employment standards simultaneously, then those things there's a kind of good case for doing things in the round, in the sense of if you don't do that, then the pressure can come up through reduced hours or more insecurity. But if you do it all at once, that's just like a lot of stuff being put onto employers. Do you see that there's potential trade-offs there?
There's always a point when you get to trade-offs.
Yeah.
I think we're very, very far from that point. I think it's worth thinking back to 97. It's worth looking at the range of employment rights improvements that were delivered, as well as the minimum wage over that period of a Labour government. We had a whole range of new entitlements in terms of working time, in terms of flexible working, in terms of paid time off and leave that came in alongside the minimum wage. And there was a direction of travel driven in large part by the European Social Chapter and legislation that was coming from the EU of continuing to drive up pay at the same time as employment standards. And we've now had 14 years where there has been no progress at all on employment standards, and despite a few opportunities, for example the Taylor report that some will know about, to try and move incrementally forward, nothing really came of it. So just because we've adjusted in policy terms to that norm, I would suggest that we don't need to use that as the evidence base for what the normal might be going forward. And I think we can learn from other countries, as I was alluding to, where actually we are so far down the OECD benchmark in terms of the regulation of our jobs market, that there is much more I am confident that we can do to address those issues that Alan talks about, by continuing to ensure we have a low pay commission that looks at the rate of the minimum wage, sets an ambitious approach for how it continues to rise and to grow. I mean, the low pay commission, for example, has recommended itself that the age rates should start to be removed. We know from employers that we hear from that very few large employers now even use the age rates. They're a bureaucratic abomination. Nobody much really likes working in a job where they know that the person next to them is being paid a different rate just because they're a year older. There's actually increasingly amongst employers these, and that's a commitment that Labour make in Making Work Pay, by the way, to remove discriminatory age bands in the minimum wage, but doing that via the Low Pay Commission with insight from what's happening and in line with recommendations they have made seems to me entirely compatible with, at the same time, looking at the jobs market and thinking, yes, we do have too many people on these contracts where, because the opportunity is available, the entirety of all the risk of employment is being borne by the worker and none of it is being borne by the employer. And it's entirely right that we can, at the same time, look at how we use employment protection legislation to reduce the opportunities for that sort of employment practice, in turn driving us towards the higher productivity business models that we all want to see, in turn putting more money in people's pockets and moving us towards the higher growth rate. So I suppose what I'm saying is, absolutely, we need the growth, we need the productivity. Higher employment standards can be part of moving us towards that, and alongside a minimum wage where you've got a low pay commission approach to being ambitious, but also to being clear that nobody wants to see a minimum wage that's leading to the sorts of labour market effects that have often been forecast but have not yet emerged.
Thank you. Brilliant. Okay. So my last question, because it is been touched on and is kind of at the heart of a lot of debate about Labour's proposal. I feel bad that we're focusing on Labour's proposals in some ways, but there aren't many other proposals in the other manifesto. I don't mean that that's not shade. That's just a sort of factual statement. But we are going to. So let's focus on the issue of day one rise. And I spoke to here's my straw man on this, which is it's a bit like a right to a contract reflecting regular hours worked, which is that people could pretend there's going to be a big fight about this because there's different sides between unions and employers, and actually it can be worked out because day one rights basically you know, 2 years, frankly, is a very long period, and I think most people, if you look comparatively, would think that. The move to zero, move to day one, is a big shift. I think most people would accept you want to have some sort of probationary period within that. I think that's the view of some people in the union movement, and there'll be discussion about what that probationary period looks like, and that is a thing. That but like that's a resolvable thing. Equally, a right to a regular contract. There's a debate about the reference period you use to measure how many hours you regularly work. That needs to be resolved. But you know, in the scheme of things, that is resolvable with goodwill. Am I just sort of naive about how easy these things are, or are people making a bit more of this than we need to? Nicola, you go first, and then Louise.
I mean, I don't think it's naive at all. I think it's entirely resolvable. And I think that there have been some of the voices who have engaged in public debate around this, who are, you know, engaged in making a wider political point or a wider point about their different view of the sort of labour market we might want to see, rather than actually looking at the legislation as it stands and what this particular proposal is. I think it's really important to look into the detail of what the proposal is. So at the moment you have to wait 2 years before you have protection from unfair dismissal. That is dismissal where there is not a dismissal because of your competency, because of your performance, because of gross misconduct. It used to be 1 year, and there's no evidence base I've seen anywhere of the shift from 1 year to 2 year doing anything at all in terms of overall labour market effects. It will just have left a lot of people in a situation where there hasn't been any proper process around about what they're doing, and you know, after just before 2 years they find themselves booted out the door to avoid any risk of an employment tribunal. Removing that 2 year period and saying that from day one you have protection from unfair dismissal does not mean in any way at all you have protection from dismissal. If from day one you start in your job and you are not performing, you are not capable of doing the job, you are not meeting the expectations of the job, you can still be dismissed fairly by the employer. And I think that's the sort of crucial part of this discussion that is often missed. No one is banning dismissals, and the Labour New Deal document is very clear on that. Under the current legislation, under the current ACAS Code of Practice, dismissal is perfectly possible. It just means you have to have a process alongside it, and you know, probationary periods whereby the process shows that you set someone some probation objectives, if they don't meet them, you dismiss them, appear to me to be entirely aligned with a process where you still are protected from being unfairly dismissed, which would be a dismissal on the basis of nothing other than someone not liking the look of you. Is it fair to ask someone to give up a job and move into a new job and then find that although they've done the job perfectly well, they can be booted out the door because they don't fit? I don't think it is.
Okay, that's a good answer. Louise, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think there are genuine concerns from employers about some of these proposals, but a lot of it is where we don't really have that detail about what they mean. So again, I think, you know, taking that example of the day one rights, originally it was, you know, from day one, all of these things will come in.
Yep.
And I think one of the other points to what Nicola said is just to emphasise as well, within that you always have, you know, rights around discrimination, things like that. That's always the case from day one anyway. So then we say, okay, well, what does that mean about probation periods? Because I think, like I say, they are important, particularly when, you know, employers and employees are both kind of sussing each other out. Is that the right fit? So we have got guarantees from the Labour Party that they would allow probation periods to happen. But again, I think the question is just there on the detail of, okay, well, what does that mean? So I think you're right in the way that you balance it. I think there are genuine concerns about this, but it's where you can have a discussion. And actually the place that we're trying to get to of higher paid, higher quality jobs in the UK, I think hopefully we can all agree on that. But I think there does need to be a lot of discussion about how you get there. And I think that's important. Why, if any of these policies were to come in, if a Labour government to win, that you just have that consultation period and have those discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. You heard it here first. I think this is very resolvable. That's what I'm going to say. We want to hear from you. I think we've got a mic. We do have a mic in the room. So I'm going to take showers if you want to ask a question in the room. Are you all going to be very shy? No? Okay, so any more? We'll take a group, yeah. So we've got the gentleman in the middle. There's another gentleman in the back. Someone maybe who isn't a gentleman too would be great. But you start, tell us who you are.
Chris Galpin from E3G. So thanks for the really interesting presentation. I was quite shocked to see how poorly the UK performed compared to other countries in terms of workforce participation after COVID. I think it's quite easy in this discussion to think, well, obviously, that was a challenging time for everyone, so naturally it's going to have an impact. But to see other countries recovering is and how much more they're recovering is kind of shocking. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear the panel's views on, why is the UK doing so much worse than other countries? Was it just that we were starting from a higher point? Is it, Alan talked a bit about mental health. Is it primarily that? Is it to do with an ageing workforce? Is it to do with poor living conditions? Is it a bit of everything? Interested in your views.
Good question, which we'll come back to. There was a question towards the back of the room. I've lost, that gentleman there.
Thank you. Krishna Chowdhury from Jetro. I was hoping to ask a bit more about healthcare and economic inactivity. You did mention in some of the speeches that it was one of the core problems that we're facing, but in the policy front, we haven't seen a lot or mentioned too much about that. So I was hoping to hear a bit more about what you'd expect or what we can hope to see from the next government about that.
Okay, that's another related question. Any more from the room? We'll take both of these and then we'll come back to the panel. It's all men, but anyway. Okay, not your fault. No, go ask away.
Paul Jackson from Stream Technologies. Louise, I believe you mentioned the apprenticeship levy. I'd be interested to know what the different views are from the panel on it, and also if you could just clarify what the different positions of the parties are on it, that'd be great.
Great, thank you. So that's for you. And then just one more over here in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen from the Department for Work and Pensions.
Hello.
I think one of the first things that was mentioned is that the unemployment rate has changed due to effects that occurred in COVID. Something about more people are unable to work than they were before. Do you feel that the effect of people getting more ill over time do you think that effect is understated in the fact that it seems that we are not as unproductive as before? Do you think it's a small factor? How serious do you think that long-term illness is affecting our economy? Do you believe that perhaps long-term sickness is underplayed in the conversation?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so it's interesting that so many questions are kind of inactivity, health, post-COVID related. And we did when we had a really good discussion about this actually last week on some of these issues, which we might draw on. Hannah, is there anything you want to add on those points?
It's certainly, I think the rise in long-term sickness it's definitely a big part of what's happened post-COVID, obviously, and I think, as I said earlier, it's obviously really concerning. Some forms of inactivity, we should be more worried about than others. If the rise was entirely, students, for example, that's not necessarily a bad thing if, people are going to just enter the labour market later. But clearly, if people are unable to work due to a health condition, that's really concerning. I think there is also something around kind of the ageing of the population, and a couple of my colleagues put out a report a couple of years ago now about kind of looking at the post-pandemic kind of inactivity rise in the round. The fact that we've had an ageing population has partly, it's not unrelated to the fact that more people are unwell, but it's also had a kind of separate impact. There's kind of intricacies of the UK kind of pension system that means that there's been, as well as the sickness, there was a kind of peak in early retirement, which was partly linked to the fact that in the UK, unlike other countries, it's basically easier to take your pension early, and that kind of played a role as well. But I think the big picture and the area where policy should be focusing, which to be fair, both of the main parties' manifestos are focusing, is on sickness, and it's worth saying that a lot of that sickness is also a kind of at the other end of the age spectrum among young people, and particularly around mental health, which again, kind of both parties do pick up in their manifestos. But I do think that's a really important area to focus on, and in particular when it comes to young people, kind of solving the issues that are kind of that are really coming to prominence now for that group will have longer term impacts, because the risk is that for young people in particular, if you don't support them back into work now, that could lead to longer term worklessness in the future.
Louise, do you want to speak to the health and activity point, but also on, can I just say on skills? So you asked about apprenticeship levy, and I know that's something that you sort of CBI cares about a lot. But while you're kind of got the floor, we've had a number of questions about skills, and it's interesting that we didn't really talk about kind of workplace skills. and the manifestos don't say much about. And there's a touch on apprenticeships, but they're pretty silent about workplace skills, to be honest. And you wouldn't really think we've had 20 years of declining investments, both by employers and by the states in training. At the same time, we're all saying, oh my God, we've got no productivity. I mean, it is just sort of bizarre, the silence. I mean, it really is. So, I mean, that's not all down to employers, although it is partly down to employers, but it's also the state's got a lot to answer for too. So I think there's a lot of blame to share, but like, where's your take on that? Because that's obviously so important to putting right a lot of the things we've been talking about.
Yeah, well, that's it. Yeah, we'd love to see a lot more on skills. I think particularly on the apprenticeship levy, I think one of the issues that we have is particularly for those larger firms that pay into the apprenticeship levy, they then don't have kind of control over how that can be spent. And so therefore it might not really fit with their needs. And I think it works really well if you're set up and, the employees that you're hiring want to do kind of 12-month apprenticeships. You've got to have kind of time off site and things to do it. That is great, and it does work well for lots of employers. But increasingly, lots of individuals need kind of short, sharp training, particularly again when we're talking about some of the new skills in the economy, when you're thinking about responding to some of the technology changes on the green economy, when you're thinking about tech and AI, you don't need to send people off on 12-month apprenticeships. And if your spending and training budget is caught up into the apprenticeship levy, then you haven't got that additional funding then to spend on other forms of training. So we would really like to see reform on that, and it's a big kind of pain point for employers. In terms of what's covered in the manifestos, the Conservatives do talk about apprenticeships in terms of more apprenticeship places, but they don't really talk about reform of the apprenticeship levy, and like you say, there's not so much on wider skills. For the Labour Party, they are looking at reform of the apprenticeship levy and thinking about using half of that pot to provide more flexibility so employers can provide that on more training. So that's kind of closer to the model that we would like to see. But like I say, I think on either of them, there's not really that wider skills strategy.
Yep,
and I think, like I say, that's something that is really important, particularly when you're thinking about those big economy challenges like reaching net zero. We need to think about how we're having the right welders, the right project management, the right electrical engineers to make sure we're building all the pipelines for the things that we need to see.
Time is rolling on, so if Alan, Nicola, if you could be brief, but we look at the trends in ill health and inactivity post-COVID, and there's a lot to be scared about, frankly. I mean, if you believe the Labour Force survey data, and I'm not sure we should, but if you do, it's the first parliament since Thatcher's first term where employment has ended up lower than it started. So, which is quite a kind of, I mean, maybe that's a data blip, but like that is quite a thing. So, we've been relying on that as that's kind of what we've been resting on as a country in lots of ways. So, I mean, what is going on, like in terms of the role of ill health, big picture? How important is that in this story? Do you think? Is it just that we're older, or is it that we're much sicker, or both?
No, I think. I mean, first of all, there's a big health warning around these labour market statistics.
Yeah,
I mean, there are other sources which don't say that employment is lower, and those statistics are more reliable on the total employment, I think. And that's connected to response rates. The Labour Force survey have fallen. Even before COVID, I was a bit sceptical of their model of non-response bias. In the US, where they've looked at how COVID has affected response rates to labour force surveys, it's had quite large effects. So it may be just quite a bit of it is sort of illusory. I think, but then if you look at, say, benefit statistics, you see it there as well. So that clearly is something that's more sort of real. I think what a lot of these benefits is the evidence over many periods of time is that once people get on these benefits, it's quite hard to get them off. And so the effect of COVID is for a variety of reasons. Some might be just it had a bad effect on people's mental health, but some might be administrative about how in the pandemic these benefits and claims were assessed, meant that more people moved on. And once they're on, even when the effect of COVID goes away, it's quite hard to get people off. And that's always been the challenge around these benefits.
Okay, that's brilliant. And I have to say, Alan, there's so many questions here that I can't do justice to, but someone said, I don't have a question. I'd just like to say that Alan's lobster shirt has really caught my eye. Okay. So I felt remiss not to pass that on to the audience. And it was my favourite question of the lot, even though it wasn't one.
Thank you, Mum.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, but if you could, that's a segue to deal with, but to go back to the questions.
Without referencing lobsters, I think there's other data points that I agree with pretty much everything everyone said. I won't repeat it. There's other data points that are red flags, like falling life expectancy, the scale of kids who are continually absent from school. Those show
Real
us,
things are happening.
Those show us there is real problems with people's health, with young people's mental health and young people's education participation that are very big social policy problems that I think need more airtime and more policy focus than has been the case. The adult skills budget is absolutely appalling. We had a report out showing that skills funding for adult skills is down sort of 50% across where it was at the start of the Conservatives' period of office. That means the starts for the number of people who are adults undertaking extra learning and training is down by a similar amount. That's absolutely shocking. I had to go and double check the statistics because I wanted to be sure that we were claiming this correctly. And it is, again, not really part of public debate, I don't think, but it will definitely have had an impact. And I suppose the only other reflection I've got is that on Alan's point about benefit claims, it is absolutely true. I remember visiting a job centre in Aberdeen, booming jobs market in Aberdeen in 2005, when there was the Labour Party New Deal for disabled people work going on, trying to help people move off incapacity benefit into jobs. This was like a really tight labour market. There was lots of jobs available. These are people who had been on incapacity benefit for 10, 15 years, actively coming into the job centre, really keen to have the opportunity of decent labour market support and getting into work. And the ambitious outcome targets for the activation rates for people on that programme were 10%. And that was, the assumption that success would look like. And that was a well-funded welfare to work scheme in a really tight labour market with political ambition behind it. So I think that tells you the scale of the challenge that we are storing up if we don't intervene now to improve population health and to get really good quality support in place.
Great. Okay. I could talk to this lot for hours, but you'll have jobs to do and people need to do other things. So we are going to bring up the answer to a poll to see what you all think the top priority should be for a new government, if we can. And I'm curious to see, is it a high minimum wage or is it something else? What have we got, Tara? It's not a high minimum wage. That's interesting.
Only 3%.
Wow, I was thinking it might not be top. I would not have guessed 3%. But supporting more people into work is a standout winner, which, hard to argue with. Better enforcing, we've got to enforce existing rights, people. It really matters. It really, really matters. That is fascinating. And sometimes you feel you can guess what the winner's going to be, but I don't think I would have got that one, so that's great. We are out of time. So let me finish by saying thank you to all of you. And I know we had lots of people joining online today, and I did not do justice to all the questions online, so I am sorry. We just didn't have the time. Thank you to a brilliant panel. So let's give them a round of applause. And I want to say a final thank you that we don't normally say to someone who was in the room and hiding at the back, called Tara Goley, who has done, I hate to think how many events Tara has organised for the Resolution Foundation. Tara is soon to leave us, having been here for quite a long time. I think this is probably about her 300 event or something. Everything that has gone right. If you've ever been to any of our events, any of the glitches were Torsten's fault, is what I'm going to say, or perhaps mine. And everything that went right was down to Tara. She's an absolute star for this organisation. So I'm going to ask you all to give her a round of applause too. Thank you.